It's hard to believe that Wilmington's Grand Opera House has a recorded history that would fill a book as thick as the one that I'm holding now. But here it all is. And from the time in 1842, when famed Victorian tragedian E.L. Davenport praised it through its seedy state in the 50s and 60s, up to the day more than 100 years later, when famed conductor Eugene Ormandy billed it as the greatest concert hall acoustically he'd ever performed in, we have a great history to be proud of. And the book I'm holding is called The Grand Experience, and it was written by our next guest, Toni Young. Toni, welcome.
Thank you very much.
You know, you billed the history of the Grand Opera House as a melodrama in 5 acts. Now, can you explain this?
Absolutely. I think that all of the elements of the story really do add up to a melodrama. It starts with a rise to grandeur back in 1871, a glorious dominance of the entertainment scene for some 40 years, a tragic decline in 1910 in the early teens, and then a heroic rescue that's just taken place in the last decade. Those are all the classic elements of a good melodrama.
That's true. Now, we have some very interesting slides. Perhaps you'll watch the viewer and be able to tell the viewers what we're seeing now.
Here we are first, back in 1871. You can see why the Opera House was indeed called a splendid ornament, the most important building on Market Street. It overshadowed all the adjacent buildings.
And what do we have coming up next?
Coming up next, you're in for a rude awakening. The Opera House, 100 years later, in 1971. I'm afraid, in the name of modernization, storefronts were put in front of that cast iron, and the total look of the cast iron facade was gone.
About what period was that?
That was about 1971, just before the rejuvenation began.
And next, what will we see?
Next, you're going to see a detail of what that facade looked like.
Oh, yes, I recall
The grand
this.
sign. I'm sure many of you remember that. It certainly did hide the original cast iron, and it certainly did convey the image of a movie theater rather than any first-rate theatrical place.
Of course, things have improved since then. Now, what will we see next in the next slide? Do you recall, or is that it?
I do believe we have 1 or 2 more.
Yes?
I think we're going to see next what the Opera House looked like
Here we are.
after the restoration, just about when the restoration was complete, in 1974. You can see how carefully it's been preserved. You can once again see the beautiful cupolas and the mansard roof.
A lot of attention to detail as it originally was structured.
Absolutely, yes. A very careful restoration. We actually found one of each original cast iron piece and were able to have them all recast out in Salt Lake City.
And what's our last slide?
I believe that our last slide is going to be a picture of the interior of, well, first we have the decayed interior. This is a sample of what it looked like in 1971. Too many years of the movies. Our last shot will give you an idea of what all of you have made possible, what Delawareans have restored and made their Grand Opera House, their performing arts center once again.
Ah, yes. Now, Delawareans were very hostile to the theater at the time the Grand was constructed. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Delaware has a tradition of being rather anti-theater. Back in 1834, when the first theater was built, many citizens shook their heads in dismay and said the entire town was destined to go to ruin if so many of their friends and neighbors patronized so wicked a thing as a theater. And that prejudice really didn't change much. Back when the Opera House was built in 1871, the church took occasion to deliver many sermons against the theater. The theater was considered a corrupter of morals, and people who went to it were of dubious character. In fact, as late as 1881, when an opera was put on here by Ford's Opera Company, the people complained because women appeared in tights and jerseys, and this was a most disreputable way for ladies to appear on the stage. They would have preferred wide pantaloons or something like that.
Now, what are some of the big acts that came to the Grand during its glorious days?
The biggest acts were always your comedies, your tragedies, drama. That always accounted for the largest number of performances. In fact, the first week the Opera House was opened, the Wallach-Richards troupe came in for a week. They did 8 performances in that week. The final one was somewhat of a fiasco. That Saturday night they were performing Oliver Twist. And the actors apparently were anxious to leave town. So after the 4th act, Wallach came in front of the curtain, thanked the audience for coming, and said it was time to leave. Well, the play wasn't over at all, but Wilmingtonians didn't know that. So they clapped, left the theater, and everyone went home early. Big stars always came to the Opera House because it was on the route between New York and Washington and Philadelphia. Buffalo Bill was one of the great favorites. He was here numerous times in the 1870s and 1880s. He was known to stand on the stage and shoot apples off people's heads, stand upside down on his head while he was shooting. After one performance, a critic commented that if the Indians he brought with him couldn't shoot any better than they did at the Opera House last night, there was no need for the buffaloes to fear. But they could always count on Buffalo Bill to bring a good house. There was some music, but serious music was never given the type of concern it is today. Big bands were much more popular. John Philip Sousa, for example, was here a good 8 or 9 times in the last decade, 1890s and early years of this century. John Philip Sousa was very well known by the people, and at one performance, when he broke into the Washington Post, the whole audience stood up and clapped and cheered and said, "This is our salute to you, John Philip Sousa."
Very interesting. Now, at times, the interior of the Grand was converted to a ballroom. Is that correct?
Yes, that was a rather unique feature. There was a wooden floor that could fit over the whole parquet, covering all those seats, and it made a flat floor, so you could set up tables, booths, there were art auctions, there were fairs, there were dances. The Washington Fire Company held an annual ball every time it was George Washington's birthday on February 22nd.
You know, what caused the downfall of the Grand, would you say? What was its lowest point?
In one word, it was the moving pictures. The Opera House had begun by incorporating movies as early as 1897 with Edison's Vidoscope. But as the years went on and movies were more and more popular, the Opera House substituted movies for the rich variety of events they had had before.
Of course, now we're all familiar with the happy ending.
The happy ending, yes, did take place 100 years later on December 22nd, 1971, when citizens got together and decided, let's test this theater and see indeed if we can't make it a performing arts center once again. A centennial concert was held, a gala, and it worked. People came back. After that, a new Grand Opera House Corporation was formed, and I think the rest of you know the rest of the story from there.
That's right. Well, it's a very colorful history, and I want to thank you for coming on. And, of course, we can purchase this book around town at the bookstore at the Grand Opera House.
At the bookstore at the Opera House, at the Greenwood Bookshop, at the Opera House itself.
Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Toni. Stick around because you're going to see a song now by Eighth Day.
Great. Thank you.